context API. Okay, so what is context API? Okay, so till the time we have seen how to share the data from one component to second component, basically from parent component to the child component, how to share the data, that we have seen. How to share the data from parent component to child component by using the props, right? That we have seen. Now let's say there is a scenario when, let's say P1 want to share the data. Let's say there are another tree like structure C2, and from C2 we have the another tree like structure C3. Let's say from P1 I have to share some data to C3. Okay, so how to share the data from P1 to C3? By using the props. Like I have to pass these props from P1 to C1, from C1 to C2, again I have to pass these props, and from C2 to C3 I have to pass these props. Okay, so like it's like a delegate, like I have to pass the props from P1 to C1, from C1 again I need to pass this as it is prompts to C2, then from C2 again I need to pass this prompt to C3, and here I can access this data in the C3. Means to pass the data from P1 to C3 I need to pass these props through the all the components which comes in a like a hierarchy, right? So if we have the multiple component which is like having the tree like a structure, that times props is not a like a suitable option, because we have to pass through the multiple components, right? So even like this data is needed for C3. Okay, it has to pass through all the child component, so it adds the extra load on the application, and like extra work also to, and also it is difficult to maintain. Okay, so to avoid that one, when we have this multiple component tree like a structure and tree like a hierarchy between the component, and when we want to share the data, the suitable option is the like a context API. So that time we can use the context API. So what is that one context API? So basically what we have to create one context in the application. Let's say this is the like a my context. Okay, I have given the name context. Okay, now this is the context. Okay, so let's say P1 parent component want to share the data with the C3, and let's say P1 want to share the data called as D1. This D1 data he want to share from P1 to C3. So what it will do? So P1, okay, will set this D1 data inside this context. Okay, P1 is setting the data inside the context, that is D1. Okay, now the here P1 act as a like a provider. P1 is acting like a provider. Okay, now we learn the two concepts. One is the like context, that is nothing but the we treated the one context. This is nothing but the one container kind of thing. Okay, in which we will save the data. Context is nothing but the one container. Okay, now in this container P1 want to share the data with C3, so whatever data he want to share, he will add into that container, that is in my context. Okay, now the component which is storing the data or want to share the data, that will act as a like a provider. Okay, now the next one, this data needs to be accessible, or the like needs to be used by the C3. So what it will do, C3 will get this data from this context. Okay, and how it will, like it will be like a then consumer. Here C3 becomes the consumer. Okay, here P1 put the data D1 inside this context, so P1 become the provider, and C3 is going to consume that data, so that's why C3 becomes the consumer here. Okay, so by looking at diagram, you must be getting the feel like whenever we want to use the context API, basically there are four things comes in a picture. First one is we have to create context. Okay. Second one is like a provider which will add the data. Third one is like a consumer which will consume the data. And fourth one is like a use context. Basically consumer will consume the data by using the use context hooks. Okay, so basically these are the four things you keep in mind. Okay, so now we get the idea, like four things are keep in mind while using the context API. Now let's see how actually it works. Okay, so first one is like, as I said, we need to create a one context. Okay, so for that one what we need to do, we can create a one file. Okay, let's say let's say like my context dot js. This is the file name what I have given. Okay, inside that file on what I will do, I will create one constant. I will give the name like let's say my context is equal to, here we have to use the create context method. It's from the React. Create context, that's it. So and here we have to write the like a export default so that it is available for other component, my context. So what I did, I have created the one component and I have declared as a like a export default. Okay, and my context name is like a my context. This is the name. Okay, and this is from the my context js file. So this is the first step is done. Now let's say, as I said, I want to share the data from P1 to C3, right? C1, then I have to share this one to C2, and this is the like C3. So this is like our current structure, right? Means let's say if it is a P1 component, okay, let's say like I have created one functional component, okay, and let's say like this is the P component. This is the one my P component, right? This is my P component, which returns the UI, right? So basically this is my the component. So basically in this one return, okay, I have on this C1 is the child component, right? So this one like let's say C1, this is the child component I have in the my parent component. Now as I said, the P1, it's like a provider. P1 want to share some data to the C3. Okay, and for P1, C1 is the like a child. Okay, and this C1 is again parent to C2 kind of thing. Okay, so like in P1 we have the C1 as a like a child, which is like a added in the P1 component. Now in this case, okay, what we have to do, we have to create the provider, and provider will share the data. As I mentioned early, like let's say P1 want to share the data D1 kind of thing. Okay, so we have created already the context, right? So what we have to do here, let's say I am creating the one variable inside this P component. Let's say I have created the one variable constant. Okay, let's say I am giving the name as a data, and value is equal to let's say D1. This is the value. Okay, now what I want, P1 want to share this data to the C3. Okay, basically C3 is internally added or implemented in C2, and C2 internally is a part of C1. So basically this is like a child inside child, child inside child kind of thing. Okay, so now what I have to do, I have to wrap this C1 inside the provider. Okay, means I need to provide the data. So here is the P component, this is nothing but the provider. So what I have to do, I have to wrap this C component, C1 component with the like context tag. So what we have to do, we have to create a one context tag here, nothing but the same name, my context. Okay, so we have to give the my context dot provider. We have to give the name as a, like a provider. Okay, and same we have to enclose the with the same tag, my context dot provider. Okay, so this is the tag. Okay, closing tag. In the opening tag there is a extra attribute that is like a value, what value we want to share. So here the value is nothing but the data. So what I can see, inside this value tag, inside this value tag I can provide the data bracket of the opening tag. So what I did, this is the like our component C1 inside the P component. Okay, so what I do, I have to wrap this by the one tag that is like a provider tag, and whatever the data we want to pass, we have to add into the tag value. Okay, so this is the data I am passing to the C1. So the whatever the components comes inside this C1, like C1 having the component C2 or C3. Okay, so all the components comes under this C1 will have the access to this data. Okay, because we are providing that one. So whatever the components comes under this hierarchy of C1, like C1 will have the C2 and C2 will have the C3. So all the component will have the access to this my context data. Okay, so now this should be clear. Okay, now what we did, on the parent component we wrap this the child component with the one tag that is the my context dot provider, means like provider is sharing the data, and what data they want to share we have given the in the value attribute. Now let's say now I want to consume this data into the C3 directly. I don't want into C1 and C2, but in the props we have to pass the props, right? But now we are using the context API, so directly we want to consume in the C3. Now let's say I am in C3 component. Now C3 component, I am inside the C3 functional component. Okay, now here in the C3 component, what we have to do, we have to create one variable constant. Let's say I have given the name as a my context only. I given the same name, my context. Here we have to give the tag, or we have to use the hook called as use context. Use context, and inside that one we have to give the name whatever we have given here, that is the like my context, right? The same name we have to give here. And this will be like we have to import, this is not a string, so we have to import the statement here, my context. Okay, my import my context from my context.js file. Okay, like that we have created the constant. Now this constant has the access to the all the values whatever we have added here. Okay, so if you want to display here directly in, let's say in h1 tag I want to display this this whatever the value, I can simply go and here I can write my context. As it's a directly value, we can use the like my context, it will display. If you want to it, if this data is a, it's like a JSON or object, then we can write like a my context dot name, or name whatever the like name, or dot age, whatever the uh, name of this field we can display here by using that my context. So this one when we use like a use context hook, means it's become the consumer. Now here if you observe, we have not delegate the props from parent to C1, C1 to C2, or C1, C2 to C3. directly inside the C3 where we need that one. We have used the hook called as use context, and by using that context we have used that the data. So this is how we use the context API. So in next video let's see the practical.